Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. I'm really pleased to have with me James Perloff. He's the author of several books, including The Shadows of Power, which was the first book of his that I read. It's sold over 100,000 copies. Tornado in a Junkyard is another one that he's written that is very interesting. And the one we want to talk about today, and actually the first Tuesday of every month, is Truth is a Lonely Warrior. It's a book that I am most fascinated with. It is, and as I say, we want to talk to him on the first Tuesday of each month about this book, taking 2 chapters at a time. When I read the book, I said, this is something we need to spend more than just one session. We need to really get into it because I think it's so important in terms of understanding what's going on in American politics and American economy today. So, Chapter 1, we talked about Chapter 1 and 2 last week. Chapter 1 was titled 6 Wars. That was a discussion of the last 6 major wars that the U.S. has been involved in. And then Chapter 2 was titled The Powers That Be, and that identified David Rockefeller and other and the organization that he was the Rockefeller is very much involved with, the Council on Foreign Relations, located here in New York City. But I know that many of you will probably say, oh, yeah, there you go again, Taylor, you conspiracy nut you are. I would just like to briefly read a quote from David Rockefeller in David Rockefeller's memoirs. Page 405, David Rockefeller said, quoting David Rockefeller, said, "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interest of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it." David Rockefeller. So there you have it. I mean, right from the horse's mouth, he's suggesting that we are important, powerful people, and we are about structuring a one-world government, in essence, and he's proud of it. Well, last month in our discussion, James Perloff discussed, as I mentioned, the 6 wars, the last 6 wars, and how the likes of the Rockefellers and other very powerful men were able to influence the media and stage false flags that rallied Americans to engage in war. You know, it's really, you have to have the population behind a war to really prosecute it successfully, and then sometimes it's not all that successful, as we found out in the Vietnam War. But, you know, so we discussed the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Iraq War, and I would encourage all of you, if you haven't heard the first interview that we did, to go to J. Taylor Media or to the Turning Hard Times into Good Times website at the Voice America Business Channel to tune into that. But better yet, let me also suggest that you buy the book at Amazon.com. You can buy the book, and there are, I noticed quite a few comments about Truth is a Lonely Warrior. So a lot of people are reading this book. And today we want to talk about chapters 3 and 4 of the book. Chapter 3 is titled The Devil as Banker, and chapter 4 is titled How the Cartel Has Run America. So thanks, James, for joining me again.
Jay, it's a delight and honor to be on your show again.
Always good to hear from you, and let's get right into it. There was actually, let me just turn to it here, a quote I'd like to read to my listeners from Abraham Lincoln. This is in Chapter 3 of the book. Lincoln said, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned. An era of corruption will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands, and the republic is destroyed." That was Abraham Lincoln. He wrote that, or stated that, in November 21st of November, 1864. Well, James, here's the question. I wonder, can you give us some examples of how the prejudices of the people, or let's say the propaganda, or the desires of the people have been manipulated by the powers that be?
Well, Jay, my book doesn't really concern it so much with the prejudices of the American people, even though I had that quote from Lincoln there, although it's fair to say that prejudices are built up through the media, which we know today mainstream media is controlled by just 6 giant corporations. We have examples of that in the wars episode of the last talk we had together, where we talked about how false atrocity tales were told to the Spaniards in Cuba to heat up the potential for the Spanish-American War, and there were false atrocity stories about the Germans cutting off hands of children in Belgium, which were later discredited. And, the 1991 Gulf War, we had the story of the baby incubators deaths that were turned out to be completely fabricated. And so prejudices can be created in order to generate a policy. But I think if we talked about what people want in life, and your show deals a lot with prosperity, I've noticed that in looking at the establishment that runs America, that they often have paired the phrase peace and prosperity over the years and promised us peace and promised us prosperity, which people do want. So in that way, they're working upon the desires of the people. But those promises have always been broken. World War I, they promised that would be the war to end all wars, and we know that it wasn't by any means. And, prosperity, you've got the Security and Prosperity Partnership now, which was born out of NAFTA, and NAFTA was supposed to bring us prosperity, and of course it didn't. After NAFTA and we got into GATT and the World Trade Organization, we saw millions of jobs heading overseas and the American economy in decline. So they will certainly work on public opinion to get their policies agreed to, but it's basically their prejudices and desires that this book is concerned with.
Yeah, now how to spin it around, though, to make the people believe that they're getting a great deal seems to be the way the game is played, isn't it? I mean, it's all about a great deal of deception, it would seem to me. Well, if America was meant to be by the people and for the people, it certainly doesn't seem to be heading in that direction these days. And it's I think a crime against the American people has been and is being perpetrated by a ruling elite. But as you point out in your book, you say follow the money. That's what we don't ever want to try to find out where a crime is committed. Most often, at least big crimes, it involves money. Talk to us a little bit about where does that path, that follow the money path, lead to?
Well, let me give you an historical quote. This is from Ferdinand Lundberg. You might be familiar with him. He wrote for the Wall Street Journal and other financial publications. He wrote a landmark book in 1937 called America's 60 Families. And I'm just going to give you a quote from the beginning of that book, which is then elaborated by this very long book now out of print. He said, quote, "The United States is owned and dominated by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families. These families are the living center of the modern oligarchy which dominates the United States, functioning discreetly under a democratic form of government, behind which a de facto government, absolutist and plutocratic, has taken form. This de facto government is actually the government of the United States, invisible, shadowy, is the government of money and a dollar democracy," unquote, Ferdinand Lundberg. And he goes on to show how presidential candidates who became presidents like Herbert Hoover and Woodrow Wilson, be they Republican or Democrat, were actually chosen by the 60 before the American people ever had a chance to vote. And so that is why it is correct to say that democracy is to a large extent an illusion right now in America, because it's even worse than in Lundberg's day. Remember, that quote is from 1937.
Yeah. Oh, indeed. And, okay, so, well, certainly the Federal Reserve was created. You point to the Council of Foreign Relations, and, I see these guys from the Council of Foreign Relations, very well spoken, very well dressed, seem very civilized, seemed, very decent fellows. I see them on Bloomberg all the time, and they're all there, trying to tell us about how they're making life better for us. So why are you critical of the Council of Foreign Relations? I mean, they seem like such good guys.
Well, first of all, big money can buy a lot of PR and a lot of nice clothes, but it doesn't necessarily buy the truth. And let me just quote what a former member of the Council on Foreign Relations said about the organization. That is Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate of the U.S. Navy. He was in the CFR for 16 years. He said, quote, "The goal of the Council on Foreign Relations is submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. in the entire CFR lexicon, there's no term of revulsion carrying a meaning so deep as America first, unquote. And let me just point out, Jay, that this is not a patriotic organization. This was formed in 1921 as a direct reaction to the U.S. Senate's rejection of America joining the League of Nations because we did not ratify the Versailles Treaty. And they were, the banksters were not happy with that. They wanted world government, and so the CFR was formed. And their flagship journal is called it's called Foreign Affairs. And their very first issue, in 1922, they had an article called "The Next Goal for America." I'm sorry, that's not quite the right title. I don't have it in front of me, but
that's the idea.
They spelled out was that we should join the League of Nations. And then the second issue, which I do have in front of me from 1922, declared, quote, "There's going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into independent states. The real problem today is that of world government," unquote. And you can bring it up to 2006. Richard Haas, president of the council, says, quote, "Sovereignty must be redefined if states are to cope with globalization. Globalization implies that sovereignty is not only becoming weaker in reality, but that it needs to become weaker," unquote. And you just go on and on. Weakening national sovereignty is a prerequisite to consolidating the world, and these guys are behind NAFTA, behind internationally behind the EU, which are they're just regional stepping stones towards their ultimate goal of a world government. But the other reason I would criticize the council is the way they've dominated cabinets of presidents through the years. And
yes,
this is from the rear cover of my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Since its 1921 founding, which small organization has produced 21 secretaries of defense, 19 treasury secretaries, 18 secretaries of state, and 16 CIA directors. Of course, that's the council. Bill Clinton picked 12 CFR members for his cabinet. If you look at the cabinet today of Obama, you've got John Kerry at State, Jacob Lew at Treasury, his predecessor Geithner were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. The guy who just took over at Defense, Ashton Carter's a member. His predecessor Chuck Hagel was a member, as was his predecessor Robert Gates. Homeland Security Chief Jay Johnson's a member. Head of Commerce, Head of Energy. Why do you have one organization? Remember, this group has less than 5,000 members, so why does one organization get to dominate the presidential cabinets of both Democrats and Republicans going back many decades, and why hasn't the public been made aware of this?
Well, that's a very good question, and I would guess it has something to do with something you wrote in your book, Shadows of Power, talking about how this same group of elites have gained control of the American media, the major media.
Well, yes, and as we were talking about, there's 6 corporations that own over 90% of the media in America. It's right. Time Warner, Walt Disney, Viacom, News Corp, CBS, and NBC Universal. And you look at Time Warner, and, people think we have diverse media because we got, all these TV stations on cable, but Time Warner owns not only Time Magazine, but it owns CNN, it owns HBO, it owned America Online before the spinoff, it owns TBS, TNT, Sports Illustrated, Fortune Magazine, Money Magazine, People, it just goes on. It's true for all these 6 corporations, and if you look at their leadership, what do you see? You see the CFR, Rupert Murdoch, who owns News Corp, is CFR. If you go to CNN, the president of Time Warner, Jeffrey Bukis, member of the CFR. You look at the news anchors, Judy Woodruff, Paula Zahn, Aaron Burnett, over the years, CNN members of the CFR.
Right.
When I wrote The Shadows of Power in 1987, it wasn't easy to do research as it is now. There's no internet, but I found in my research that of 14 directors of CBS, this is 1987, 11 were members of the CFR. Again, they only have about less than 5,000 members. So again, how do you have this one group at the heads of corporations, banks, governments, and media?
Okay, so how you have it is you finance it. You have to gain control of the printing press, which is what the Federal Reserve was all about, right? The Federal Reserve created before the CFR was created, but do you tie in the Federal Reserve and the people behind the Federal Reserve that created the Fed as part of this same cabal, as sort of this same ruling elite?
Well, absolutely, because David Rockefeller, who's been called, the kingmaker of America, he was the one who basically picked Jimmy Carter to be president. he was long chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations and still is the honorary chairman. He's actually the grandson of Nelson Aldrich, who introduced the original Federal Reserve legislation. That was his maternal grandfather, and it was very much, if you look at the original membership roster of the Council on Foreign Relations from 1921. It's all J.P. Morgan people. I mean, it was J.P. Morgan's personal attorney, John W. Davis, who was the original president of the CFR, and the original vice president was Paul Cravath, who was also a Morgan attorney, and the original chairman was Russell Leffingwell, who was a partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. So
okay, so we're talking about banksters, and the chapter 3 is titled "The Devil as Banker." So you had to get control of the money system. You had to get control of the printing presses. You had to be able to print money so that you could then buy government, buy the media, and buy wars, essentially, and redistribute and restructure the maps in accordance with the one world government that these guys are trying to form. And again, I was just struck by what you were talking about a moment ago. It sounded, I think it was Haas that you were quoting, sounded just like David Rockefeller in his quote in his book. So this is not anything that is not known. We know what these guys are up to. These guys are trying to form a one world government. And they're doing about it, I think, all the wars in the Middle East. We talked to Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity on my podcast on a weekly basis, and it sounds to me like these guys are really making some headway towards forming a one-world government.
Well, out of chaos will come new organizations, new systems of control, just as, the chaos of World War I was used to create the League of Nations. The chaos of World War II was used to create the UN as well as the World Bank. And if they had a World War III, they'd be looking at a global currency and a global government.
We're just 2 minutes yet, and we're just almost out of time. I have to tell my listeners they got to buy this book to read about. There's lots more to talk about. We can't get to it, but the motives for creating the Fed, stocks and bondage, something from nothing, soaking the American people, the redistribution of wealth, the taking away of liberty and freedom from the individual, and taking that power and giving it to an elite group of people is what Lincoln warned about. What Lincoln was warning us about back in the 1860s. And it's happening. It's happening right now in a very, very I think, very accelerated manner. Chapter 4, How the Cartel Has Run America, and we just don't have time to get into it, but some of the topics there, 1921, the Council for Foreign Relations was formed, by essentially the Rockefellers come into the picture in a big way. Then, post-World War II, the United Nations was formed. You had the Marshall Plan, very interesting insights there, and, maybe we're going to have to pick up on Chapter 3 the next time we talk, James, because we were just out of time. But anyway, 30 seconds for a closing comment, perhaps, from you.
Well, Jay, thank you very much for having me on. I think it's just a matter of critical thinking and analysis to see that the pattern of events that we're seeing unfolding, this is not a random amalgamation of events. When we see deceptions being used consistently to bring us into wars, and we see the same people at the helm serving in the cabinets of the presidents, we know that this is by design. The guys who planned the Federal Reserve System on Jekyll Island wound up running the system. Paul Warburg, who ran that meeting that formed the Fed, wound up being the first vice chairman of the Fed. Benjamin Strong, who was at that meeting, wound up being the head of the New York Fed, the first head of the New York Fed. So this is not by coincidence.
No, not by coincidence.
No. Yeah, this is by design, and people need to understand the design of the past and how it's led up to today's events and the suffering, economic and individual, as we go to war after war that the American people are now experiencing.
Right. We got to take our heads out of the sand, folks, and try to see what's really going on. So thank you very much, James, for being with us again, and we'll look to do it again in the next first Tuesday of next month. Thank you so much for being with me again.
Thank you, Jay.